The old house had always been a quiet place, a two-story cottage in the middle of a wooded area, its walls lined with memories of decades past. Olivia had purchased the house after moving out of the bustling city. She was seeking peace, solitude, and perhaps a fresh start after a difficult chapter in her life. The isolation had been perfect for her needs. It was far enough away from the nearest town that her only companions were the wind and the occasional deer grazing in her backyard. The house, though aging, was charming. The hardwood floors creaked underfoot. The walls had a yellowed hue, and the faint smell of wood and dust lingered in the air. The house had a sort of melancholic beauty, the kind that comes from years of quiet living. Still, Olivia knew there were some things about the house that were a little off. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Olivia would be sitting in her study, working on her writing, when she'd hear something faint, a small noise, like a splash. At first, she chalked it up to the house settling, the wind pushing against the old windows, or perhaps the creaking of pipes that hadn't been used in years. But then it happened again, and again. Each time the sound was unmistakable, a splashing noise coming from beneath her feet. It was always coming from the floorboards in her living room, near the center of the room. She'd pause, listening intently, but the sound would cease before she could figure out exactly where it was coming from. It wasn't loud, not at first, just faint enough to make her wonder if her mind was playing tricks on her. Perhaps it was the house settling, as old houses do. But then the splashing became more frequent. It wasn't just a trick of the mind. It became a rhythmic sound, something that seemed too deliberate to be an accident of the old house. Olivia began to feel uneasy. She'd stand by the living room window, watching the dark woods outside, trying to ignore the feeling that something was lurking beneath her feet, something waiting. Weeks passed, and the splashing grew louder. Not much louder, but enough to disturb her. She would sit at her desk and hear it through the floorboards, as if something was moving underneath her. It was a strange, wet sound, like something struggling. The sound was different now, more pronounced. She felt the need to investigate, but she didn't know where to start. Was it a pipe leaking somewhere? Was there an animal trapped beneath the floor? She decided to lift up one of the floorboards. There was no obvious damage to the floor, no crack or gap that would allow something to move underneath it. But when she removed the board, she found nothing. The space beneath the floor was dark, empty, and dry. No water, no creatures, just old beams and dust. Olivia was confused but chalked it up to the house's age. Perhaps the sounds were nothing more than the walls adjusting, or rats scurrying in the walls at night. She went back to her writing, though the unease gnawed at her. The next day, however, she returned to the living room and noticed something odd. The floorboards seemed to be damp, just a little, but enough to make her wonder. She knelt down, feeling the wetness with her fingertips. The moisture was spreading slowly across the boards, not quite puddling, but enough to make the wood feel slick. She checked under the floorboards again. This time she felt a subtle dampness in the air, like something was slowly seeping up from beneath. The splashing noises had grown louder by now, almost insistent. It was as if something or someone was trying to get her attention. The air in the room felt thicker, more suffocating. She was beginning to feel as though she wasn't alone in the house anymore. The dampness in the room continued to spread, creeping up the edges of the walls, staining the wallpaper. She didn't know what to make of it, but the floor had grown wetter with each passing day. The smell of mold and stagnant water began to fill the air, a scent that was impossible to ignore. She had heard of houses with problems like this, broken pipes, faulty drainage, but she couldn't find any visible leaks anywhere. One night, after hearing the splash once again, Olivia decided to investigate further. She waited in the dark, sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the floor. The sound came again, a soft, almost liquid-like splashing that seemed to echo in the stillness of the house. Olivia jumped to her feet, moving toward the noise. As she reached the center of the room, she noticed something chilling. The floorboards around the spot were no longer just damp. They were wet, soaked with water that seemed to come from nowhere. She moved carefully, stepping closer. The room was silent except for the occasional creak of the house settling. She knelt down, her hand hovering over the water. It was cold, far too cold for a simple leak. Something about it didn't feel right. There was an odd sensation in the air, a palpable tension, like the house was holding its breath. Without warning, the floor beneath her foot gave way. The dampness had spread so thoroughly that her foot sank into the wood, splintering the surface as if it were soft mud. She gasped, pulling her foot back, but before she could react, something pulled her in. Her body lurched as her foot sank deeper, and she fell forward, her arms flailing for balance. The dampness turned into something more sinister, and before she could scream, she felt a hand, cold, skeletal, and impossibly strong, grip her ankle. She tried to pull free, but the hand held her with a terrifying force. Panic surged in her chest as she scrambled to free herself. But another hand, then another, appeared from beneath the floorboards, dragging her deeper into the wet, suffocating darkness. The last thing Olivia saw before she was pulled entirely under the floor was the dim outline of a figure, its shape twisted and grotesque, emerging from the depths of the wetness beneath her feet. Its hollow eyes gleamed with malice as it gripped her, pulling her down into the cold and damp void where no light could reach. The splashing noises stopped and silence filled the room. The next morning, the floor was dry once again. The dampness was gone. The house was quiet. No sign of Olivia remained. The floorboards, once soaked with water, were now dry, their surface smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever happened. But if you listened closely, you could still hear the faintest splash echoing from beneath the floorboards. The days passed, and Olivia tried to forget what had happened. She wasn't sure if it was just a bad dream, or if her mind had played tricks on her. She had heard strange things about the house before she moved in, whispers of a family that had lived there long ago, people who had disappeared without a trace. But she didn't believe in rumors. She was a woman of reason, a writer who thrived on logic, facts, and clear explanations. She had to believe that what she'd experienced was just a product of her mind, an overactive imagination. Yet the unease didn't go away. The house, which had once seemed like a peaceful retreat, now felt like a prison. She had grown restless, spending more and more time in the study, her mind constantly returning to the splashing sounds beneath the floor. She told herself it was just the house settling, or maybe the sound of pipes shifting. Still, it was hard to ignore the way the floorboards had seemed to shift and warp after that night. One evening, while she was sitting at her desk trying to work on her latest manuscript, she heard it again. The splashing. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. She froze, her hand gripping the edge of her desk. The noise had been coming from beneath the floor again, just like before. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, and moved cautiously toward the living room. She knelt down, placing her hands on the floorboards, feeling for any sign of wetness. At first, everything seemed normal. The wood was dry, firm beneath her fingers. But as she pressed down, she noticed something odd. The faintest dampness began to seep through the boards, cold to the touch as if the moisture had been lying dormant just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. Her pulse quickened as she realized the floor was no longer dry. It had been getting worse for weeks now, but she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The floor was damp, soaking in places. Her mind raced as she wondered what could be causing it. Water was seeping from somewhere beneath the house. Was there a broken pipe? Had someone, been hiding in the crawl space beneath the floorboards? The thought of an intruder lurking beneath her feet was enough to send a chill down her spine. Olivia stood up quickly and moved toward the back of the room, where the house's old wood furnace was located. She had planned to check the pipes there, hoping to find some clue to explain the dampness that had been growing in the living room. As she entered the narrow room, she found nothing that could account for the problem. The pipes were intact, the furnace working as it should. She sighed in frustration, her shoulders heavy with the weight of her growing dread. As the days wore on, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The splashing sounds didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to get louder and more frequent. Now, it wasn't just at night. During the day while she worked at her desk, the sound of splashing water would drift through the floorboards, echoing through the empty house. She had begun to feel as though she was losing her mind, like she was hearing things that weren't really there. The dampness spread further, staining the walls, creeping into the corners of the room, and pooling near the edges of the floor. At times, it felt as though the very air in the house had grown heavy with the moisture. The temperature seemed to drop, as if the dampness had a life of its own, creeping up the walls and sinking into the furniture. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its wooden bones expanding and contracting with the shifting moisture beneath the floorboards. Olivia knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to do something. She had to get to the bottom of what was happening. She called a local contractor, a man named Robert, who had worked in the area for years. He arrived a few days later, looking skeptical, but willing to take a look at the house. Robert was a large man, broad-shouldered and gruff. He had a no-nonsense attitude and a quick wit, which Olivia appreciated. He immediately set to work, examining the floorboards and poking around beneath the house. For hours, he worked in silence, his tools clanging against the wood, his footsteps echoing in the crawl space beneath the floor. He checked every corner of the room, lifting boards, peering into cracks, and trying to find any explanation for the wetness that had taken over the space. After a long time, he emerged from beneath the house, covered in dust and dirt. He wiped his hands on his pants, his face drawn with concern. "There's no pipe leaking down there," he said, his voice low. "Nothing unusual in the crawl space either. No signs of water damage anywhere." Olivia felt her heart sink. "So, what's causing it?" she asked, her voice shaky. Robert frowned. "I don't know, but I've been working in old houses for years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like the floor is absorbing the water from somewhere else. The moisture is coming up from underneath, but there's nothing there to explain it." She stood in the middle of the room, her gaze fixed on the damp floorboards. The splashing sounds continued to echo beneath her feet, but now they seemed louder, more insistent. She could almost feel the pulse of the house beneath her, like a heartbeat coming from the floor itself. She had the distinct sense that something was moving, something was stirring just below the surface. Could there be something else? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something unnatural. Robert didn't respond immediately. He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing in thought. Finally, he shrugged. You're asking the wrong person. I deal with pipes and wood, not whatever else might be going on here. Olivia nodded, feeling a sense of dread creep through her again. She thanked him and paid him for his time, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house was silent, but she could still hear that faint splashing sound. Later that night, she found herself back in the living room, staring at the wetness that had spread across the floor. The dampness had worsened, and now the room felt cold, colder than it had ever been before. It was almost as if the air itself was alive, shifting and changing with the water that seeped through the floorboards. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't stay in this house much longer. Something was wrong, something deep and dark. The sound of splashing came again, but this time it was louder, more urgent. Olivia flinched, her eyes darting to the floor. The wood beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as if something was pushing against it from below. She could feel the pulse beneath her feet, a slow and steady thrum that seemed to vibrate through her body. The floorboards began to warp, bending in unnatural angles, and the wetness spread even faster. She backed away, but before she could move, a terrible cracking sound echoed through the room. The floorboards buckled, and a section of the wood splintered open, revealing a gaping hole beneath. The splashing noise was louder now, accompanied by a strange, sickening squelching sound. Something was moving beneath the floor. Olivia took a step back, horrified, as the floorboards creaked and shifted. A hand, pale, with long, thin fingers, slipped out from beneath the floor, its skin slick with water. Another hand appeared, then another, and they began to pull themselves up from the darkness below. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. She turned to run, but before she could make it to the door, the hands reached out and grabbed her ankles, pulling her down toward the opening in the floor. Her scream was cut short as she was dragged into the darkness beneath the house, the sound of splashing growing louder and louder as the hands pulled her deeper into the wet, suffocating blackness. The air was thick with silence as the splashing sounds slowly faded away. The house settled, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of its own history. The dampness that had plagued the living room for weeks was gone, as if it had never been. The floor, once soaked, now lay dry and untouched, its surface smooth and undisturbed. The coldness that had permeated the house seemed to lift, and the stale smell of mildew began to dissipate, replaced by the faint scent of wood and earth. In the aftermath, the house was quiet, too quiet. The faintest breeze stirred the curtains, but even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb the eerie calm that had settled over the space. The walls, once thick with the suffocating humidity, now felt strangely hollow, as if they had absorbed something far darker than moisture. The silence stretched on, unbroken and oppressive. A week had passed since Olivia's disappearance, and yet the house remained unchanged. The townspeople had noticed her absence, of course, but no one had ventured up to her cottage to check. It was a place people rarely visited, and Olivia had been a solitary woman since the moment she arrived. Rumors of strange noises, of things that had happened in that house before Olivia had come, floated through the village like a fog, but no one dared to speak of them openly. After all, the house had always been a place that gave people an uneasy feeling, one that could not be explained by the usual stories of old homes, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. The door to the house, which had once been locked tight, now stood ajar. The faintest creak could be heard when the wind brushed against it, a sound that sent a shiver down anyone who walked past. But no one dared to enter. The house had a reputation, after all. One day, a curious young couple from the village decided to take a walk through the woods, hoping to find a quiet spot to escape the daily pressures of their lives. They came upon Olivia's house just as dusk was beginning to settle in. They had heard the stories, of course, but the thought of exploring the abandoned house intrigued them. With a mix of nervous excitement and adolescent bravado, they approached the house, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves that lined the ground. The door creaked as they pushed it open, the darkness inside inviting them with an eerie silence. Their flashlights flickered uncertainly as they stepped inside. The air smelled stale, but there was no trace of the dampness that had once filled the house. The floor was dry, the walls unmarked, and the faint sound of splashing had long since disappeared. They moved cautiously through the living room, their eyes scanning the space. Everything was still, too still. The house felt like it was holding its breath, as though something were waiting just out of reach. The couple moved deeper into the house, exploring the rooms one by one, until they reached the study. It was there that they first noticed something odd. A small, rectangular object lay on the desk. A book, but not just any book. It was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, its cover cracked and worn. The couple exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. One of them reached out and flipped open the journal, the pages rustling with the sound of brittle paper. The first few pages were filled with neat, elegant handwriting, notes, observations, musings. It seemed like a collection of thoughts from someone who had once lived in the house. The couple read on, the words detailing the strange history of the house, of the family that had once called it home. They read of a tragic accident that had taken place in the house many years ago. A drowning, some whispered, though the details were never fully known. The journal spoke of something darker, something deeper beneath the house. It described the splashing noises, the strange wetness that had plagued the floorboards, and the unsettling feeling that came from the dampness that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. The final entries, however, were the most chilling. They spoke of a presence, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been trapped beneath the floor for years. The journal's last entry was a single sentence, written in a frantic scrawl. "It's waking up." The couple stood frozen, their hands shaking as they held the journal. The room felt colder, the silence heavier, as though the house itself had heard the words. The air seemed to thicken, and the floor beneath their feet creaked ominously. The young woman glanced nervously at her partner, her voice trembling. "We should go," she whispered. But before they could turn to leave, the temperature in the room dropped, and the faintest splashing sound echoed from beneath the floor. They looked down, their hearts racing as the floorboards beneath them seemed to shift, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. The wood groaned, and then, with a sudden, violent crack, a section of the floor gave way. They staggered backward in shock, but it was too late. From the opening in the floor, a hand shot up. A pale, slick hand, its fingers twisted and long, like a ghastly puppet pulled from the depths. It was followed by another hand, then an arm, then a body. The figure that emerged from the hole was not fully human, not entirely. Its form twisted and misshapen, its skin slick with water. Its eyes were dark and hollow, two pits of nothingness that seemed to swallow the light. The couple screamed, stumbling back toward the door, but the figure reached out, its grip icy and strong. It yanked them both toward the floor, pulling them down into the dark void beneath the house. Their screams echoed through the empty rooms as they were dragged into the suffocating wetness that had been building for years, as if the house itself had finally unleashed its horror, its long-guarded secret. The house stood still once more, its windows empty and dark. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves outside, but there was no sound from within. The door creaked closed as though it had never been opened. And so, the house remained, its sinister history hidden beneath the silence. Time passed, but the memories of those who had vanished never fully faded. The village spoke of the house in hushed tones, telling tales of the strange noises that came from the woods, of the flickering lights in the windows on dark nights. But no one ever entered the house again. No one dared. Years later, the house was left to rot, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of its own dark past. The floorboards, once warped and soaked, now lay dry and brittle, cracked with age. Yet beneath the surface, something stirred. The splashing sounds returned, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the walls, echoing from beneath the floor. No one was around to hear them, but in the quiet stillness of the house, the presence that had once lurked beneath the floorboards waited. It was patient, ever patient, and as the years wore on, it grew stronger. It had been waiting a long time for the next curious soul to come along. The house was no longer empty. It was only a matter of time before someone else would hear the splashing, and the pull would begin again,